Amen. All right, so this morning we're going to be looking at Genesis 40 and 41. Does anyone remember where we left Joseph off in Genesis 39 last week? Where was our friend Joseph at? Yes, he had been put in prison. And why was he put in prison? Did he commit a crime? It's actually the exact opposite. He did not commit a crime. He was framed by Mrs. Potiphar, which sounds like a Clue villain or something. But Mrs. Potiphar was the one that framed him. And Mr. Potiphar put him in prison for that and was a little bit upset. So kind of thinking about prison this morning, I've got Prison Mike on the screen, of course, from The Office. I don't know a lot about prison, just like Prison Mike. I know there's no Dementors, but aside from that, I know that prison's not a place I would do well in. I would struggle with my faith probably a little bit in prison, especially if I didn't commit a crime. And as we think about this, I think back to what Keith was talking about 3 or 4 weeks ago on Wednesday night, just the work he's done in prisons locally in Florida. That's not exactly a great place necessarily to grow your faith, right? You're probably going to struggle, especially if you didn't do anything to deserve being there in the first place. But what we're going to see as we look at Joseph this morning in Genesis 40, Genesis 41, is that he maintains his faith during this situation. And I think that that's something that we can definitely learn from as we look at this today. So let's read Genesis 40, verses 1 through 8. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So we see 2 gentlemen in prison. We see it's the chief cupbearer and the chief baker of the king. Now there is a common denominator between these 2 professions, if you will. What would be a shared thing between the cupbearer and the baker involving their work? Exactly, food. You've got the cupbearer whose job we know very well from Nehemiah later on, that his job is to basically to eat and drink the food of the king before he eats it himself and potentially gets poisoned. The baker is obviously making the food for the king to consume. So we know that for some reason Pharaoh is upset with them. We don't know if it's because something was undercooked. We don't know if it was a poisoning attempt. We don't know that. But Pharaoh ultimately puts both of them in prison. And I thought this was interesting. We see in these verses that we just read that the captain of the guard is the one that actually puts these people directly in the charge of Joseph. If you were to turn back one chapter and look at 39:1, you would see that Potiphar is identified as the captain of the guard. Now, I don't know a ton about Egyptian bureaucracy and things like that. Maybe there were multiple captains of the guard. But there is a possibility that Potiphar is the one that we see in Genesis 40, potentially putting the cupbearer and the baker in the charge of Joseph himself. So I thought that was interesting. And then one last point before I open it up for comments and questions. This idea that interpretations belong to God. We see here very clearly that Joseph is giving the credit for these things to God. Even though he's been in prison, he's still giving God the glory for what he's able to do. The other point I wanted to make is if you were someone that was put in prison and you had a dream, or let's say you're not in prison, you're just walking around one day and you're talking to someone and you're troubled and they're like, "Hey, you look troubled, what's going on?" And they go, "Well, you had a dream. I can interpret that dream for you," right? Would we be, I guess, willing, or would we put a lot of faith in that interpretation from that person we just met? And the odds are probably not. And to the cupbearer, to the baker, Joseph is a slave in prison, right? So they're telling him this. I mean, literally, they're kind of a captive audience at this point. But they are listening to what Joseph says, and they will see the fulfillment shortly after that what Joseph says, that the prophecies he's giving them through God, or God's giving them through Joseph, are actually true. But just a reminder that interpretations belong to God. And actually one other point I wanted to make here as well is if you turn back over to Genesis 37 and you look at what Joseph's family's reaction were to his dreams and his interpretation of the dreams, their reaction was they wanted to kill him. So I think it's really interesting when you think about Jesus, kind of drawing a parallel between Joseph and Jesus. When Jesus was on the earth and he was saying that he was actually the Son of God, we see that his own people, the Jews, did not want to accept that. They did not want to have anything to do with that. And we later see after after Jesus ends up going on and dying and is resurrected, we see that Jesus actually is accepted by the Gentiles more than his own people, the Jews. So I thought that was an interesting kind of parallel between Joseph and between Jesus. So any thoughts or questions on Genesis 40 before we move on? Genesis 40, 1 through 8. Ross.
Just a good reminder to always give credit to God. Like, obviously, we don't interpret dreams
Yeah.
today, but like if somebody asks you for advice and your advice comes from, like your knowledge of the Bible and stuff like that, make sure to give credit to God. That's like such a good reminder, evangelistic tool, etc., that it's not coming from our wisdom or from our knowledge or whatever, it's coming from God.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Anything else? Yes, Abraham.
I liked in verse 6 when it was talking about, like, Joseph saw that they were in trouble. Like, even in the situation, he's still looking out for those that are in need. Like,
Yeah.
he could have been, like, so focused on himself, not even looking out for others. But even in this lowest point, he's still looking out for the distress.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, too, because Joseph, he's a slave in a prison. Like, he's still going out of his way to look out for others. So that is a good point. All right, any other thoughts or comments? All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next set of verses. This is going to be 9 through 23. So we're going to get into what these dreams mean as Joseph is interpreting them through God helping. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, 'This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit.' When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, 'I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head.' And Joseph answered and said, 'This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him.'" So we get some interesting details here, right? We get the cupbearer's dream, which is, of course involves squeezing of grapes into a cup. We get the baker's dream, which involves food on his head being eaten by birds. Both things which would be involved with their profession, right? The cupbearer, things for the cup; the baker, things that were baked. So I thought that was very interesting. And if you think about it, just like we were talking about earlier with the analogy of someone you've never met before is, telling you your dreams are true. If you're the cupbearer and you survive this, right? Because he does. You see that obviously Joseph told your dream correctly. He told the baker's dream correctly. That's going to give, in the cupbearer's mind, validity to Joseph and what he's able to do with God. So we'll see this come up, but it's going to be, as we learn in chapter 41, it's going to be 2 years later that the cupbearer finally remembers Joseph and what happens. And I did want to raise the question of how would we deal with a situation like that? Oftentimes in our lives, we have in our minds a timetable of things of when we expect God to answer our prayers, things like that. And sometimes that doesn't work out. And if you're Joseph in this situation, he does leave it open to interpretation about when when you can get me out, right? He's not like a time frame of, hey, cupbearer, I want to be out in a month, make it happen. He's not doing that. But the text does say that the cupbearer actually forgets him, and we see later in 41 where he acknowledges that. So I think this is another point to make about Joseph, that obviously he has very strong faith in God, that he's willing to wait, that he does not lose that faith while he's forgotten about in prison for 2 years. So any thoughts or questions on this before we move on? Ross.
Another Jesus parallel. There's two criminals, and one's going to be restored to a high position, and one won't.
Mm-hmm.
They're with Jesus slash Joseph.
That's a very good point. Anything else? All right, let's keep on moving. So Genesis 41. We're not going to read beginning in verse 1. We'll actually pick up in verse 8. But ultimately here we see that the dream bug is catching about 2 years later, and Pharaoh starts having dreams, right? So we see beginning in verse 8 of chapter 41. Let me find that really quick. So in the morning, his spirit was troubled. Of course, Pharaoh had the dreams while he was sleeping, so that's the part that we missed. So in the morning, his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. As he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in the dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. So, thinking about this, obviously he has these dreams, similar pattern. Pharaoh's troubled by these dreams. And we see that in light of the magicians of the time not being able to interpret these dreams, the chief cupbearer speaks up and says, Oh yeah, I remember this guy in prison that could interpret dreams. Maybe we should get him. And I did like the fact that the magicians couldn't interpret it. And the reason why I bring that up specifically is if you were to look at Daniel 2 with Nebuchadnezzar and his dreams, Nebuchadnezzar approaches this in a much different way than Pharaoh does here. What is the difference between, obviously you didn't study Daniel before this class, but does anyone remember what the difference is between how Nebuchadnezzar approaches his magicians and how Pharaoh's approaching his magicians here in this chapter? Yes?
I believe Nebuchadnezzar was very threatening with his.
He was very adversarial, for sure. The other thing that he did is he did not tell them the dreams up front. He was like, hey, if you can interpret dreams, tell me what I dreamed in the first place, and then tell me the interpretation. But Pharaoh, we see here, is telling the dreams up front and then asking for the interpretation of those dreams after he's already said what he dreamed. What I find interesting about that is I can't help but think of two-factor authentication, which is kind of the bane of my existence now. You know, it used to be back in the day, you just had to enter your password and you're on the website, you're good to go. But now you've got to enter your password and they text you a code or they scan your face or something, and then you get to do what you were trying to do to begin with. Nebuchadnezzar's kind of using two-factor verification. He's looking for both, tell me what I dreamed and then tell me what the interpretation is, whereas Pharaoh's just like, hey, here's my dream, tell me what happens. But we'll see, and as we know, it's very obvious that this is obviously the interpretation of the dreams as things play out after the fact. But any thoughts or questions on this before we move on any of these verses? Yes?
This may be an odd connection, but to me it makes sense.
Trust me, nothing's odd in this class.
You know, when it talks about our influence, right? How our influence can be for good and for bad and how we are remembered. And this passage at the end there of chapter 40 in verse 23. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. And then he ended up remembering him, right? And good came from that. And the connection here, I think, is one of my favorite passages in all of Scripture, Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8. When a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came into power in Egypt. And you think about the ramifications of a new king coming to power in Egypt, not knowing Joseph, and what that meant, and how bad the Israelites were treated because of that.
Yeah, and that is a really good point. It's something I was thinking about too, and this is obviously skipping ahead, but we know that Joseph stays in Egypt till he dies, right? And eventually his family comes down as well. Very much seems like Joseph was in a position he couldn't walk away from. You know, it's almost like he signed up to help the Egyptians, and once he signed up, there was no leaving. I don't know if he wanted to leave. He might not have wanted to leave. And obviously God's plan was for them to stay in Egypt and grow as a nation, grow as a people. But it still raises the question of just how important Joseph was to the nation of Egypt. He was monumental. He was monumental. He had a huge impact. Any other thoughts or comments? All right, I'm just going to be straight up. Like, we're probably going to finish early today, but that's okay. Genesis 41, 25 through 36. So to not leave you in suspense, we'll now read about the interpretation of these dreams so that you guys know what they mean. But beginning in verse 25, then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is, as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow. For it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for good in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. So obviously, Joseph, with God's help, is able to interpret these dreams. And we haven't gotten there yet, spoiler alert, but Pharaoh is very happy with the interpretation that Joseph provides here. And I think that just shows how instrumental God is in this whole situation. And we see that even though Joseph had to spend, at least 2 years in prison, probably more, he's still giving God the credit. He has not lost his faith. He's still giving credit to God for everything that he's doing. The other point I wanted to make was about 20% for 7 years. So it's very important to note in these dreams that there's 7 fat cows and 7 thin cows, because that implies that there's years of prosperity before the famine comes, right? And that's what the text says. The reason I bring this up is if someone told you that you were going to lose your job in 7 years, so you need to start saving up $20, well, we'll say you're making $100 a year, right? Very low, I know, but easy math. $100 a year. You need to save up $20 every year to be able to cover your expenses for those 7 years you're going to be unemployed. If you did that math, you would find out that at your 7 years of employment and at the start of the 7 years of unemployment, you would have a total of $140 saved up, right? So if your average monthly expenses are $100, or average yearly expenses, I'm killing this analogy. If you have your average yearly expenses at $100, right, and you only have $140 saved up, that means you're going to last for like a year and some change, not much. So it's very important when we think about this to realize they're collecting 20%, but God's blessing them in those first 7 years with more than they normally had. So they're able to stockpile a significant amount to get them to last longer during the 7 years of famine. So I did want to bring that up and point that out before we move on. Any thoughts or questions on this before we get any further in? Steve? Oh man, I don't know if I can. I don't know. So you didn't have a comment, Steve? Okay. I'll take it. That's fine. Any other thoughts or questions on this? Yes.
I just think preserving the grain that long in that time is pretty amazing. I don't know that we have anything in our house. Well, we just my
Yeah.
mom probably has stuff in her house from more than 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
But normally we consume stuff within 90 days, and it's just amazing that they could store that grain for 7 years
Yeah.
and it be viable and people, help.
It really is. And I scour the internet for pictures for my slides, as you can tell. But you can see here, like, this is something I found. This is obviously a recent kind of thing. There's 18-wheelers in the background, et cetera. But if you just look at the scale of this pile of grain and with perspective to the size of this 18-wheeler, it's massive. Like, just trying to think about where that much grain, to last for 7 years, how big that pile would be, where you would store something like that, is mind-boggling to me. But I find that very interesting.
Well, I don't know about the stories and how well that'll work, but if you go to Egypt today, there are storage bins that are built into the ground.
Oh, wow.
Into the ground that are huge, and as far as you can see, there are storage bins. There's so much volume there that they can store.
Yeah.
And all of that, not a lot has been excavated, but what has been excavated is absolutely amazing.
Yeah. Thank you. Maria?
I think to your point, it makes it more impactful when you get to chapter 42 and Joseph's family hears that Egypt has, it seems like an abundance, right?
Yeah.
It's not like they're starving, like to your point, they only had so much of it, but they're not just limiting it to Egypt. They're kind of open the gates of anyone who can pay for it, you can come get it, which I think just
Yeah.
emphasizes how much God is blessing them and the repercussions of that, past Joseph's family, but to other nations, that they are coming to Joseph as well, and God's impact, grows.
That's right. And I will go ahead and make this point too before we read the text. But one of the things we'll see is that as they're stockpiling this grain, as they're collecting it year after year, if you're Pharaoh and you had this dream interpreted that you're going to have 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, how are you going to know Joseph's telling the truth? How are you going to know that his interpretation's right? Well, honestly, you're going to start seeing it year one, because you're going to have more than you did, like, probably ever before. Year two, same thing. So as you start going, you can start counting down the years. Okay, well, we're 7 years in. Next year's the famine, but at that point, I've obviously put the right man in the position. Obviously, Joseph is right about this. Like, you had that instant confirmation that what he said is right. So that was something else that I thought about too. Yes? So trust me, as I said, nothing's random in this class today.
Recently, I have been dabbling in bread making.
Yeah.
And there is a wheat berry called kamut. It's an ancient grain from Egypt. And the kernels are smaller than a popcorn kernel. And I'm told that if you keep them with no water and dark, that they'll last for 30 years.
Wow.
And that never, when I first was learning about it, we were teaching the little kids.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, wow. Like, all they needed for food were these tiny little berries and some water in a couple of days, and they had sourdough bread.
Wow.
So God's provision, they just had to keep these little wheat berries dry and
Yeah.
they could live.
That's impressive. And, that's something that we don't think about too. I oftentimes find myself thinking in terms of what foods grow in America. And I don't think about what grows in other parts of the world. If you walk through a market that has food from all around the world, you find things like jackfruit that you never knew existed. And that is something I think sometimes, at least I forget about, is what they probably actually were eating at the time. It probably wasn't corn like we know it. It probably was something different like that. Anything else? Yes. That's right. And, another reason for exactly what you just said, that the text said about having the dream twice, that obviously got Pharaoh's attention. Like when Pharaoh had the dream, woke up, fell back asleep, and had a dream that was at least in the same vein, like he knew that something was up and he had to get more information. Anything else? All right. Brought back my favorite picture. So for those of you that don't know, I've had this picture in a few of my classes. If you Google Jacob Bible, this is in like the top 5 pictures of Jacob. Now, obviously, no one knows what Jacob looked like, but I don't think this is it. So let's go ahead and read verses 53 through 57 of the text. Actually, I didn't even talk about this slide. I got so excited, I didn't talk about it. Okay, let's go back to verse 37. We'll read through this. This is actually going to be Pharaoh's reaction to what Joseph has told him. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah. Gotta love these Egyptian and foreign names. I like Joseph so much better. And he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly. And he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and he put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, "God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house." The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. So, obviously Pharaoh rewards Joseph. He promotes him to this great position. And like I commented earlier, Pharaoh's obviously going to see that Joseph's right, just even year 1, right, when everything starts producing more and more. Bumper crops. We've got record crop numbers coming in from the land of Egypt. They're able to save up easily what they need to survive this. And as was discussed, we're going to see later on that people from other parts of the area are going to come to Egypt looking for grain and buying it. I did want to also hit on the meaning of the names of Joseph's sons. So obviously the eldest is Manasseh, which we'll see something go on. I think it's in Genesis 48, where the blessings are imparted in reverse order. The younger gets the greater blessing. But in verse 51, Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, "God has made me to forget all my hardships and all my father's house." So it's very clear Joseph has moved on from what has happened before. He is at peace, or it seems to be at peace, with his brothers selling him into slavery, all of this, because he realizes that God has blessed him and that he's in a much better place because of it. In verse 52, the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. So once again, I also find it interesting that Joseph is giving God the glory in the names of his kids. You know, he's picking names deliberately that tie back to God and his glory. That's a really great legacy that he would be leaving for them, because if they're thinking about the meanings of their names, obviously God is involved with their names. Any thoughts or questions on those points in particular before we move on? Yes?
I was just thinking about like Joseph's influence that he's having, and it reminds me back to like at the very beginning of our Bible, we see like Adam and Eve called to rule and bring order and blessing like over creation, and then like throughout Genesis we've seen like people in rebellion against God not fulfilling that role, but now at the end of Genesis we're given Joseph, who's almost like this new Adam that's exalted in this place of rule, bringing prosperity, has the Spirit of God, and then
Yeah.
greater extent, like in the New Testament.
Yeah, that's a good point. Anything else? Yes.
I think we see this perspective in the naming of his sons, right? He looks back on his family and his father, and he loves them, and he sees now what God has done, his glorification in Egypt, a place that was meant for hardship and that brought affliction has made him fruitful and has allowed him to multiply. And if you had asked, teenager Joseph, that probably would not have been his thought process, but I think, that's a legacy that will continue on even past when the Pharaoh forgets him. His sons' names will continue into the tribes of Israel, and that's, I think, a really beautiful picture of his thought process and how he's come about realizing that, what he'll tell his brothers eventually, that God meant this for good.
Yeah, that's a good point. Anything else? All right, so let's go over the last slide. So beginning in verse 53, I'll read through the rest of the chapter. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Joseph said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. So we see, obviously, the 7 years of famine start, that people are looking for bread. We see Pharaoh very clearly saying, really, it's not my problem. Go talk to Joseph, and Joseph will figure it out, which I think also goes back to the level of trust that Pharaoh put in Joseph. The other point here is, of course, that people are coming to Egypt for food, and that really sets us up for what we'll talk about in the next class, Genesis 42, about Jacob's family, Joseph's family, Jacob's sons coming to Egypt to get food, and then eventually leading for Jacob himself coming to Egypt as well. Any thoughts or comments on anything we talked about this morning?
There's something I noticed. When Joseph's mother gave birth to him, she named him Joseph because it means he who multiplies. And she was striving against her sister, and she wanted to overcome her sister, so it was about her ambitions, and about worldly pursuits. But God used that name to multiply spiritually, help the Jewish nation succeed, to let his dreams come to fruition, and for God to be glorified. So Joseph, at the end of the day, multiplied in the spiritual ways by honoring God. And that's the way he fulfilled who he was supposed to be in his name and who he was.
Good point. Ross.
Thinking more about your $100 analogy.
Yeah.
It almost feels like maybe during those 7 years, if they were getting $100, what they really only needed to live on was like 10 or 15 or something like that. So like that's kind of like what we were talking about with like the overabundance
Yeah.
and able to share like or sell to like the surrounding areas. Like maybe the amount that they stored up was even more than they like might need. Like it was such abundance. That seems to kind of be what I don't know
Yeah.
possibility anyway.
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
We did a study one time about bread throughout the Bible. Bread is such a simple food, really. Like Amy was saying, it's just flour, water, pretty much.
Yeah.
And the study was going through the whole, Old Testament through the New Testament, and about how, God used bread to save his people. And so, you look at, the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, and they got manna. Here, God is telling them to store up grain so they can have bread during the famine. And then it relates it to the New Testament, how Jesus is considered the bread of life. So God throughout the whole Old Testament and New Testament used this concept of bread to save his people. And so even now, Jesus is the bread of life, saving us even to this day, thousands of years later. So I thought that was interesting how they kind of used just that simple concept to bring the Old Testament to the New Testament, about how God, no matter what, is going to look out for his people and not only provide for them physically, but spiritually as well.
It's a very good point. All right. I'll call that the class. You guys now know my weakness. If you want to start doing jumping jacks in the back, you're going to throw my class way off. But we'll pick up next week in Genesis 42. So thank you.